Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Allison Bainbridge. I want to welcome all of you, and I want to welcome our people watching live. It is my honor to welcome you to this very special event this evening with climate investor and activist Tom Steyer in conversation with Lisa K. Solomon, who is a huge supporter and friend of Book Passage. Tonight, we are celebrating the release of his new book, Cheaper, Faster, Better: How We'll Win the Climate War. In these times of apprehension and anxiety about so many things globally and nationally, I have to say it is reassuring to have people like Tom who are dedicated to helping resolve the issues we have with climate change. His persuasive storytelling and contagious optimism underscore one of the most important realities of the climate crisis. If we work together, we can solve it. This is what Al Gore said about Tom's new book. He's going to discuss his mission to combat climate change and share the inspiration and insights behind his book in conversation with Lisa. About 2012, he left his very successful investment company to become a climate investor and activist. And so he is the right person to show us how we could win the war on climate. He's the co-executive chair of Galvanize Climate Solutions, a multi-strategy climate investment firm designed to unlock the generational opportunity of the energy transition. He also founded America's largest youth voter engagement organization, co-founded a community development bank focused on justice and sustainability. Since 1986, he has been a proud San Franciscan, and he was telling us just before that he loves bookstores and loves Book Passage, so it's such an honor to have him here. Lisa K. Solomon designs award-winning environments, experiences, and classes to help people expand their futures, adapt to complexities, and build civic fellowship. Her work blends imagination with possibility, building the capacity to take the long view when today's problems seem overwhelming. I'm so excited for this conversation. It's so relevant, and we're so pleased to be able to have them here at Book Passage. So please give a warm welcome to Tom Steyer and Lisa Solomon.
Allison, thank you so much. Elaine, thank you for this opportunity to be in conversation about this very important and timely topic. And thank all of you for coming tonight. I heard they had to add more chairs, which Elaine said warms my heart when they add more chairs. I love it. And thanks to everyone watching at home. So, Tom, what an honor to get to talk to you about this fabulous book, Cheaper, Faster, Better: How We'll Win the Climate War. So we have a lot to talk about, given your many hats that you wear that we just heard about in that extensive conversation or introduction. So my first question for you is that now you are wearing the hat of author. So curious to hear why a book in all of your incredible impact activities.
Well, let me say thank you guys for coming. I was fairly confident I would be speaking to some empty chairs, and it's a pleasure to see some people in them. I really wrote the book because I felt as if, in spite of all the evidence being on our side, that in effect, the two things that Americans believe about energy are that we're an oil and gas country. We'll always be an oil and gas country. It's important to our economy. It's important to our future. And so the idea that we're actually going to make an energy transition is not true. So that's a big meme in America that I think is 100% false. And the other meme that I think is pretty prevalent is the idea that we're in a doom loop. Like, we are destroying the planet. We can't stop ourselves from destroying the planet. And we're going to really end up in a place where it's not fit for decent human life. And we should just accept that and be super gloomy. And that's not true. So I really wanted to write a book to say there's another way to look at this. It's a great chance for us. It is a challenge. And, I'm sure Lisa and I will go into that, and I welcome questions on it, and I'm obsessed with that. But it's a great challenge that we can and will succeed in. And that success will be incredibly positive for everybody in this room, everybody across this country, and everybody around the world.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you so much for your optimism. And this book is highly optimistic and grounded. What I loved about this book, and it truly is tremendous, and welcome you all to buy it and stick around and get it signed as well. Tom has generously offered to stay, is that it is a climate book. It is an energy book. It is an innovation book. It is a business model book. It is an economics book. And it's also, near to my heart, a futures and design book. Starting with the challenging of the narrative that we are in this doom loop, that there in fact is another narrative for us to build on, for us to imagine a way out of where we are today. And so I really encourage if you found yourself in some of those interest areas, this is your book. And I want to start with the language, speaking of narrative, that you use around the book. You're very deliberate about it. It's not fix the planet, it's cheaper, faster, better. How we'll win the climate war. And throughout the book, and particularly in the opening introduction, you really talk about this as a war and liken it to World War II, the calling of that generation. This is the calling of our time. So I wonder if you could just spend a little bit talking about the metaphors that you use and why you are so intentional, even starting with the title.
So I think it's important to level set about myself, which is I am a humble MBA, which means no imagination or creativity, but also hopefully some willingness to look at the facts of life. And when we think this is a global problem, and a lot of this story is going to be told in what people in our country think of as the developing world. In Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, places that are going to do an amazing amount of development over the next 30 years. An awful lot of this story is going to be told there. And let us be 100% clear. The rule in climate is the less you've done to cause the problem, the more you're going to suffer. And so if we're expecting the people in the places I just said, in those 3 continents, to say, we're much poorer than Americans, we've emitted much less carbon cumulatively than Americans. We are currently on a per capita basis emitting a fraction of what Americans are emitting, and we're the problem. You're looking at us to save you. There is no one who's going to say yes to that. What they are going to say yes to is a better source of energy that's cheaper for them and a better deal. They are going to buy better stuff. And I believe that there's a way to use what we would think of as market-based economics, capitalism, private sector, enterprise to solve this problem in a way that really works for those people and really works for us and really works for the planet. And so my point is, people, I like to say, unfortunately, kindness doesn't scale. Like if we're waiting for the world to be kind to each other, we're going to wait a lot longer than we have. But if we're going to sell stuff that's infinitely better, disruptively better to people who need it, we can win that war. And so that's why I called it cheaper, faster, better. I didn't call it kinder, sweeter, and more, charitable. And the other thing I'd say is I called it World War II because I think in World War II, we couldn't decide in America if it was worth fighting. I mean, people always think World War II started with Pearl Harbor, but World War II was going on way before Pearl Harbor, and America felt like we can't do this. We're going through the Depression, we're broke, it's a European war, it's not our war. And then we decided it was. And people really committed. And that is what it's going to take for us to really win this in the way that I think we can, that I think is best for us, and that is really our big opportunity to recreate who we are and to remind ourselves of what this country is about. And that's really why I wrote that book.
It's an incredible call to action that does have big narratives, big ideas of what we could be, like what we had to do World War II to rally behind a big cause. And I love when you say in the book, protecting humanity from climate change is the fight of our lifetime. Am I doing my part? And the book is really an invitation for all of us to think of ourselves as climate people. as again, whether you are deep in business, whether you are working in the social sector, whether you are an educator, whether you are a scientist, to fundamentally see yourself as a climate person changes the way that you think about decisions and think about the kind of investments that you're going to make. And you have a lot of examples of that. And like I said, I love this book because I think it's a futures book. And by the way, I think it's very imaginative. So we're going to have that conversation too. And you start off with the opening chapter, which is futurists don't predict the future, but they take what's available and they use that to build on. And the opening chapter is called Do the Obvious Thing. And I want to talk about some of the obvious things that we can be doing and how we can look at what's in plain sight and take that, as you say, as an invitation to challenge the status quo and do something different.
So I think that's an invitation from Lisa for me to point out a few obvious things, which I will try and do. One of the things that people think in the United States is that fossil fuel energy is cheaper, and that the reason we can't get off it is because it's a good deal and they're being asked to make a sacrifice to move to renewables or to buy an electric vehicle or to use a heat pump. And that might have been true 10 or 20 years ago, but it's not true now. So if you look at what the cost is per kilowatt hour of coal or of natural gas compared to solar or wind, I think most people honestly think fossil fuels are cheaper. They're 4 to 5 cents a kilowatt hour on a good day in the United States, and solar and wind are 1 to 2 cents. And they'll go down another 80% this decade. They're not going to get closer. That disparity is only going to grow. If you look at electric vehicles, people think that electric vehicles have slowed down. And in fact, there are electric vehicles being built in this world that cost less than $14,000, that go 1,200 miles, and which are basically blowing it out outside the United States. So when you think about there's an S curve to technologies, sort of flat as they fight against whatever the incumbent is. And then when the curves cross of cheaper, faster, better, it goes up pretty much straight to 80%. It flattens out again. And that's everything. That's the curve of moving off whale oil. That's the curve of every single huge technology change. It is not that we're going to have a revolution here. This revolution is right now. In China, they are selling more than 1 million EVs a month. Just so you know, the American car industry sells 14 to 16 million cars a year. They're going to sell more EVs in the next 12 months than we sell cars. They're going to go to 80% EVs in terms of new car sales easily within the next couple of years. So when we're looking at whether this is happening, if we're looking, it's data. It's not me being optimistic. It's me just, trying to follow the news. And I'll give you one last piece of information which blew me away, which came out on Monday, which is Pakistan increased its total electricity generation capability by 30% in the last 6 months, and it's all solar. It's amazing. They're over 50% solar. It's because it's cheap. They're just putting it on their roofs. They're not using the utility. They're not using the government. They're buying solar panels and sticking them on their roofs. So when we think about what's going on, I'm optimistic because actually we have stuff that's cheaper, faster, and better. And the question is, how fast are we going to adopt it? And how fast are we going to get rid of the stuff that's hurting us? That's the only, but is it going to win? If 1 and 2 are lower than 4 and 5, we're going to win.
I love that that's the opening chapter, is to point out that this is the data, as you said, that these aren't just Pollyanna futures, that this is the data, that renewables are cheaper than fossil fuel and oil and gas. And yet this narrative is so pervasive, right? And so part of it is the creativity to break that. Because when we tend to think about the future, we tend to think of it as an extension of the status quo and not something that is a step change different. Until you hear a story like, wait, there is an EV that's being built for $14,000 that can go 1,200 miles. All of a sudden, you can imagine that. That breaks your narrative of the way you think that cars are going to be built and what they're going to require and what they're going to cost. So I think it is really important to keep those narratives coming about what's possible that serve in our interest of all interests. Gets me to my second chapter, which again I love.
We're on chapter 2.
Wait, no, we're not going to
Did
go
you
through
guys
all of
bring
them.
sleeping bags? I'm just
No,
interested.
yeah. No, we're not going to go through all of them, but I think that they're important building blocks for then, the big point in the book, which is that this doesn't have to be an either or. We don't have to save the planet or do well economically, right? That these are and narratives.
So let me just say something about that. If we don't participate in this, it will happen. This will happen whether the United States takes a leading role or not. We can choose to try and run a 1950s economy and put up huge tariff walls and not let anything in and pump. We're the biggest oil and gas producer in the world and live that life. That will fail in every sense. And that will change how we live in terms of our standard of living. It will change our relationship to the other countries in the world, because obviously we're not a leader economically, we're not a leader environmentally, we're not a leader diplomatically. That changes who we are. Choosing to hide from the future has never worked, ever. And so the idea that we're going to choose against the data to go with the past in a way that's destructive and stupid economically, to me would be a crying shame. I don't believe we're going to do that. I don't think there's any chance we're going to do that. I think the real question for us is, how much are we going to commit to the future with us being the kind of leaders that America was designed to be? I mean, we've always tried to be on the front foot in terms of morality and, democracy with a small d, and justice. And as imperfect as we've been, the whole point is to try and be improving and getting it right and leading. And for us to pass on that after this long would be a huge mistake. And including economically, but much more than economically. Also in terms of who we are as a people and what we stand for and how we want to choose to think of ourselves and to live.
I don't know if this is said often, but amen. Here at Book Passages. But let's lean into that for a little bit around the leadership piece. So you are a model of tremendous leadership. Yeah, I know, right? Yeah, it's true. There's not that many people I know that choose to run for president in order to bring attention to the climate. So, really trying to change the narrative, that continue to start new kinds of companies, new kinds of social impact initiatives, new kinds of ranches. That was not part of your...
Well, actually, that was Kat's idea.
Yeah, that was not part of the initial... Where is leadership these days on it? I mean, it is inspiring to read this book because of all the data that you bring forward. But we need a whole lot more leadership that are standing with you to talk about it in this way that is not because it's a nice thing to do, but because it's a must thing to do.
So I think, let me make a quick point. I mean, I know how divided this country is. I mean, I think we all know how divided the country is from a partisan standpoint. And part of what I'm saying is completely against that grain, because I think that we're not going to solve this problem as Democrats. We're not going to solve this problem as Californians. We're not going to solve it as part of the country, however you want to split us up. If we're going to solve it, we're going to do it together. And people are not going to do it for the same reason. So just so you guys know, Texas has tripled its solar capacity in the last 3 years. And they're talking about 35% increase this year. They have by far the most wind capability in the country, totally blow California away, just to be clear. Are they doing it for the reasons that we say we're doing it? No. But are they doing it? Yes. And so I think part of this is we don't have to ask why somebody volunteered in World War II. We don't have to agree on it. We just have to remember that if we do it together, we're much better off. And we need to remember that they are also patriotic, hardworking, smart people, and they need to remember that about us too. And if we do that, they're never going to say to the people at Book Passage, you're smarter than us, You're better than us. We aren't going to say another word. We're going to do whatever you tell us to do. That is not happening in this world. I think I hope they say is, you're also trying to do something that's good. And you have your reasons, we have our reasons. Let's be data driven and do the right thing. And if we do that, I think that is I played on a lot of sports teams. Winning teams are fun. Winning teams love each other. You don't have to agree with the person playing left wing if you're playing goalie. You just have to win the game. And if you do, you'll think, what a great woman or man that person is.
I know you're competitive, Blair.
No.
Just a little. And there's not too many climate books that have a chapter called Think Like a Walk-On. And I want to say this one was really near and dear to my heart because I, too, was a walk-on. Rookie of the Year, tennis, 93. Yep. But the point of the chapter is not the power of walk-ons, although we are very powerful, but is the importance of finding your role if you're not on the starting team. And in part to your comment that you just made around finding ways to advance both as an individual and a team, looking for opportunities to contribute and to try to work towards a higher purpose of that. And so you've talked to lots of different audiences. You worked with lots of different leaders. Tell us more about how do you stay flexible and nimble in trying to advance this larger goal that we're after, that you're saying is the greatest challenge of our time, knowing that people get a lot of, I think, reward in being right versus advancing some of these new ideas.
So let me explain, and I think Lisa did, but let me just take off on what she said about being a walk-on. So the idea of being a walk-on is you weren't recruited onto a team, and therefore they don't want you to be on the team. They actually recruited the people they like, and you're not those people. But it's a team. So it's not like you're trying to destroy the team, you're trying to join the team. And so if you're a walk-on, the implication is you have to think outside the box. You have to be an independent thinker, but you're also trying to advance the cause. You're not trying to destroy the team. You're just trying to join the team and add to it and add new ideas. And that's really the case here, because what we're really fighting is the status quo, but it doesn't make the people in the status quo bad people. It just means we need to change the direction of where the team wants to go. And it means being independent minded at the same time that you are not rejecting the people who are part of what's going on. And so when I look at this and when I think about leadership, the question that I ask is, who is telling something new and changing where we're going in a better way? And that's we can always find people who will want to get along, the old saying in Congress, to get along, go along. We can always find that. The question is, how do we find the people who say, no, we need civil rights for everybody? Who's, the people who are going to push us forward on the places we need to go forward, even if it doesn't redound to them. That's what we need. And that's what that's, in my mind, the idea of trying to be an independent thinker within a system that you actually cherish and respect.
Yeah. I mean, and throughout the book, you're basically challenging us to develop our BS meter, to become knowledgeable of the things that matter and to not be afraid to back maybe what isn't the status quo solution, but to bring new ones forward. I want to pick up on that because one of your many efforts, Galvanize Climate Solutions, this multi-strategy investment firm that you are now a part of, you see a lot of new ideas come your way, not just on new technologies and new ways of approaching this, but also how to change the existing infrastructure in new ways. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that effort. And in particular, if there are any patterns you see, particularly among the entrepreneurs that come to you and how they're talking about joining the war against climate.
So let me talk a little bit about, so when you think about an investment, you're thinking about the people who are running the investment. So the people are actually on the ground doing something, starting a company, buying a building and changing it. We're actually doing something. And then there are the people who are putting up the money, which tend to be big pots of money, like big pension funds or endowments or you know, people who've collected billions or tens of billions or hundreds of billions of dollars. And then there are the people like me who are trying to put those two people together. And so in terms of the people starting these companies, just so you know, it's really important to have good people doing it. There's a gigantic difference between a super talented person trying to do X and a normal person trying to do X. And the good news about climate is because it's such a critical point, the number of people who are going into it and the level of people who are going into it and the quality of people who are going into it is so fantastic. And in the book, I try to highlight how awesome some of these people are. Almost all of them are young. They're coming up not just with new ideas of doing old things, but new things. So that, for instance, as an example, one of the things that's a big problem now is how do you connect all the new renewable projects, big utility scale solar, big wind farms, to the grid to deliver the electricity to somebody. It's like a 7-year wait. So who cares if you build it if you can't deliver the electricity? And it's very hard in the United States I've talked to people who've taken 18 years to build an electric grid from Wyoming to California, 16 years from New Mexico to California. We don't have 18 or 16 years. So one of the people I highlight came up with a way to use the existing grid to carry 5 to 10 times as much electricity. So same problem, completely different solution. We're not going to do it the way we did it in the 1950s. There's so many young people who are coming up with, okay, here's the problem. Here's how we solved it in the past. That's not how we're going to solve it going forward. And so some of those won't work. But the people who are doing it, I mean, it's very, very encouraging when someone walks into your office and says, I have a way of writing software to control batteries that makes them 25% more effective. That doesn't sound like much, but that's a huge deal because software is really cheap. So you don't have to rebuild the battery. It's something where you can solve problems in a very inexpensive way that are huge. And that means batteries have much more effective lives and are cheaper. And those are both huge things. So when we think about where we are in this world, we're dependent mostly on people who are 20 to 40, who are working their asses off to come up with this stuff and believe they're in it for the impact. And they also think they can build a really valuable company. And we see those people all the time. And I'll say one last thing. We also buy buildings and get them to net zero. I said multi-strategy. 80% of the buildings in the United States will be used in 2050. So the idea that we're going to build new buildings and they're going to be net zero, that's not happening. We'll do a little of that, but mostly we have to get the existing buildings to net zero. Okay, so we can do that. We then go to the people with the billions or the tens of billions or the hundreds of billions and say, we can do this and it's going to be more valuable and it's going to make more money for you. They don't always believe us. And it's really important when we think about this that we understand it's not just, it's got to be cheaper, faster, better. We have to be telling the truth. We have to show we just did it 15 times in a row so the 16th time is a gimme, so that the people will really put up enough money so that there are a lot of buildings in the United States that we need to get to net zero. It's not going to be free to do it, but it's going to make the buildings more valuable. It's going to make the people who own them a better rate of return. And they have to believe that, because whatever they say about caring about sustainability, which they do, if they get their returns.
I'm going to speak like a designer for a second here and say, when I hear you tell those stories and thinking about how you then make that pitch, you're really thinking about it from a place of empathy of what the people on the other side care about, right? You're not going and saying, we got to fix the planet. You're going to say, we're going to make this cheaper for you. We're going to make this better. And also not doing it in a way that might put up those divides because you're coming at it with the wrong incentive. And throughout the book, there are a lot of examples about aligning incentives to change systems in order to have everybody working from different perspectives towards that common goal. So thank you for being a designer. I want to double down a little bit on the vignettes that you have throughout the book on climate people. And after each chapter, there's a little vignette about the people in our neighborhood that are doing these amazing things: scientists, entrepreneurs, folks that are investing in the oceans. There's even a great vignette about a duo that's turning microbes that will eventually be the chocolate that we eat, which I thought was exciting. I thought you were going to bring some for us tonight, like the opera. Everybody gets some microbe chocolate. No, we're not there yet, but they are stories of innovation and hope, and they are incredibly diverse in the perspective. So, I don't know if you have a favorite climate.
Well,
person.
let me talk for a second about something that people, because normally I would think that people who follow climate innovation seriously, but not as professionally, think about it kind of in terms of gadgets. So it's like you think about it in terms of, wind turbines, solar arrays, electric vehicles, heat pumps, batteries, stuff you can touch. Get what I think of, if you'll excuse me, as gadgets, like physical things to solve a physical problem, because these are big, emissions come from big physical things. So let me talk for 1 second about something that most people don't think about in terms of solving climate change. And that's agriculture. Agriculture is somewhere between 20 to 25% of emissions. It's conceivably a huge source of sequestration. So the ability to take CO2 out of the atmosphere and stick it into the ground. Conceivably we could, just to put it in context, net zero means not zero, it means net zero. Like we keep emitting, but as much as we emit, we also suck out of the atmosphere and stick it in the ground. And whatever we emit, it's the same amount, and we get to net zero by 2050. And just to put it in context, to give you some numbers that are meaningless, but at least you'll get the proportions, people think that we emit something like 42 billion tons of CO2 a year, and that by 2050, we can get that down to 10 billion tons. So we have to sequester 10 billion tons of CO2 every year starting in 2050, just to give you some numbers. And if we do regenerative agriculture, I do have a point to this, believe it or not, that could be 9 billion tons. So ag could be a huge source of sequestration, which is just basically growing stuff that has big roots or big systems, and basically that's going to reduce it. So, one of the people who's here, I have a lot of friends here. Kat Taylor has been running a regenerative ranch for 20 years to prove not just how it works from the standpoint of CO2, not just from the standpoint of climate, but much more in terms of holistically, how are we going to have a planet that works from a water standpoint, because obviously we have a gigantic water issue, most of it revolving around agriculture. We've got a huge food issue, as I think everybody in the United States pretty much knows. We have a gigantic food issue in terms of the health, in terms of what we put in our bodies and what we choose to eat and what that means in terms of toxicity and, health. And so what we're seeing is people doing gigantic experiments through how we do agriculture. And then also technically, in terms of, Lisa was talking about chocolate happens to be a hugely destructive thing to grow, just so you guys know, from a climate standpoint and a water standpoint. Very, very damaging. People love chocolate. And I think it's going to be true that we're going to have another way of doing it from the destructive way that we choose to do it at the moment, which means people are still going to be able to, meet their chocolate fix, but they're going to do it. And I'll give you one last thing, because I love it so much. So I think a lot of people think that eating beef is bad, not just because of that it sucks up so much energy in terms of, how high it is in the food chain, but also that, cows emit methane, and that's a huge problem, and it's a huge source of climate change. And so just so you know, the methane from a cow's stomach does not come from the cow, but it comes from an organism that's a parasite living in the cow's gut. And they've developed an enzyme that can kill the parasite and cost 6 cents a day. So when we think about just that, and everybody's read how bad it is to eat hamburgers, and, steaks are sort of like the worst thing you could possibly do. There's still real issues about how much meat we should eat from the standpoint of where we are in the food chain and how many people there are in the world and whether people can eat like Americans. But we are going to solve the methane issue having to do with cattle before 2030.
All right, we have a meat eater up here who's very excited about that. Where I teach at the D School, we have a lot of creative ideas that come through and various fellows. And there was one of a fellow for a while that was really focused early on helping people reduce their consumption of meat. Really trying to do you got to eat better, reduce is better for the planet, and realize that was just not flying. And you even talk about carbon footprint shaming doesn't work. Then pivoted to creating an algae that the cows would eat to reduce the gas. So he said, okay, look, if I'm not going to win the argument that you should eat red meat, how do I make the cows less harmful to the environment? And again, that's that more nimble thinking of looking towards the end goal, but saying what are the different ways that I can continue to work towards it? And I think, again, your book is filled with those people that even started one way and pivoted to another. And again, that there's opportunities all around us. This isn't about shaming, right? This is about being entrepreneurial and thinking about it.
So one of the things, I think this is in the book, but it's definitely something that affected me. So one of my best friends, so someone who's been a friend of mine since we were first week in college, who's still a good friend of mine, who I think I'm going to see tomorrow, bought a Tesla probably 8 or 10 years ago. And he is definitely not a progressive. He's thoughtful and data driven, but he's basically a business person and believes that business is the way that we lift people's standard of living and make the world better. And I said, Matthew, seriously, are you now in the save the world business? And he's like, absolutely not. And he'd been driving very expensive European sports cars. He said, best pickup I've ever seen, better than a European sports car. It's just really, really fun to drive. And that's the point. He did it because he wanted to. And that's actually how disruptive products work. It's not like you're begging someone to do it. They're doing it because from their point of view, it's a lot more fun. It's a lot cheaper. It's a lot easier. It makes their life better. That's a disruptive product. I have to have product.
Yeah. We're going to get to your questions in a minute, and we do hope that they are questions. We're gonna be excited to hear what's on your mind. But I've got one more for now that you don't necessarily talk about in the book, but I know you have a lot of experience thinking about, which is, well, you may have noticed, it doesn't take to be a futurist to know we have a big election coming up. Not just for the big election that many of us are talking about, but election down ballots. And a lot of the down ballot races in particular have huge climate implications for us. So not to get into necessarily the presidential race, although we welcome you to talk about it, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on how we can become better climate voters. Like, what are the signals and cues that we can look at when we're looking at candidates to try to understand if they've gotten the memo about what we should be focused on?
So since we're sitting in California and we all have voted on presumably California ballots, we know it's almost impossible to figure out a California ballot unless it's your full-time job, which it pretty much, who should be the San Francisco auditor? Who knows? And so I think we're kind of reduced, given the complexity of the ballot and the number of choices and how difficult they are to figure out, in trying to find someone we trust whose job it is actually to go through 187 different ballot questions and a bunch of people who are running for God knows what, who we've never heard of by the time we pick up our ballot. And I think from a climate standpoint, we really have to do that because it's impossible for us to go back and look at the history of voting and the promises of all the people who are running. And there, I helped to start something called Give Green, which was something that really LCV did the work on, League of Conservation Voters, to give people scores on climate so that you could understand, where people are coming from. Look, the other thing that's true about climate is this. Sadly, the Biden-Harris administration passed the biggest climate bill in American history by far, which is the poorly named Inflation Reduction Act. Okay, and it passed, and so it's the law of the land, and we could talk about it if you'd like to. So I've probably spent a little time thinking about it. But I would say this. The thing to know about the Inflation Reduction Act is no Republican voted for it. You know, there are probably 250 Republicans who are either congresspeople or senators, and we went 0 for 250. And it's not that, I mean, that's just the truth. So when we think about where we're going, we really need to take that. It's sad. It shouldn't be that way, but it is that way. And ultimately, they're going to have to pivot and change, and they will. But the only thing that's going to encourage them to do it is if people don't vote for them. And so I really am sad saying it as an American that there's such a dividing line between the parties. It's dispiriting and something that to me is just data driven in terms of what we should do. It's just look at the numbers, look at the costs, look at, you know, the information that's readily available for anybody who wants to put in the time. And let me say, Republican voters, by and large, want climate solutions, that they just don't vote on it. They don't withhold their votes if people aren't good on climate. But over 50% of Republicans are for a robust American governmental climate response. It's just not reflected at all in the elected officials. And if the elected officials thought they weren't going to get elected, they would flip like that. And I expect that will happen.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. It gives us some things to look for. And again, going back to chapter 1 of looking for the obvious and looking at the records. All right. We know you have questions. So we have an opportunity to take a few. And again, want to remind you to make them questions because we know you all have a lot to say. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Hi, Tom. How are you? I don't think it's working. Would you like a suggestion?
Always.
Okay, because I think you're the perfect person for this job.
You didn't say job, you said suggestion.
Yes.
Okay.
I was looking for questions.
I started working, I saw this problem 45 years ago, and in the early 80s, started a company to develop large-scale wind energy technology, raised $45 million of capital from Chevron, put together 2,000 megawatts of projects with people like Hawaiian Electric, PG&E, Southern California Edison, the Bonneville Power Administration, brought in Bechtel to build all of our projects, put together vendor agreements with Boeing, United Technologies, and GE, raised $1 billion in project financing through First Boston, and then saw Ronald Reagan kill the tax credits, and the whole project collapsed, and the United States lost its position in the world of, at that time, in wind energy. We're back in it again, but we're not the leaders like we were at that point. For the last 35 years, I've spent my time developing or working on other aspects of the climate crisis. I've seen the energy crisis morph to the climate crisis. The climate crisis is now so severe that we've got to do something, and we've got to do something much faster than anything else than people are even thinking about. What the world, in my opinion, needs right now is that the problem has gone from a technology and financial crisis to a political problem. And I would like to see you run as the climate czar, with the responsibility of using the social media and the technology companies to change the consciousness about the climate. And the reason for that is you're the only one with one of the few people with the credibility to pull it off. Number 2, that has the financial community behind you. And thirdly, you've run for president and you understand the landscape. So if you would run for energy czar, I would be your first vote.
So let's. That's very nice. That's very nice. Unfortunately, the energy czar is not an elected position. So I will say the two people. So there has been a climate czar. There's the head of the Department of Energy, which is Jennifer Granholm, who's actually the former governor of Michigan and has done a very good job. Who I love. And there have been 2 so-called climate czars. It's a new position. It originally was John Kerry. And when he stepped down, it became John Podesta, both of whom I think of as people who've worked on this problem for decades, both of whom I have tons of respect for. I do, however, take your point. And the way that I would rephrase your point that I completely agree with is this, and it's the reason I wrote the book. We have to start thinking about this differently. And we do have to start thinking about the way that I think about this in the simplest way that I think I would like, of course, everyone to think the way I think is this. It's a race. It's the technology. How fast can we turn this around? How fast is the world deteriorating? And we haven't said this, and I'm sure most of you guys probably know this, but I feel it's incumbent on me to say just 30 seconds on how the world is deteriorating. So if you go back to Paris in 2015, where basically the UN and 194 countries said we can't go through 1.5 C. So no one in America knows what Celsius even means. So 1.5 C is one of the most, it's like irrelevant to Americans. It's incredibly stupid. But just take it that it's 1.5 C. And if we go through 2 C, we're really screwed. That's basically Paris 2015. So just so you know, last 12 months, 1.64 C. I mean, you don't have to know what Celsius means or where we started from or anything else. All you need to know is we're through what they said we can never go through. And you don't really read that because the way that climate scientists do temperature is they average the last 10 years, which I say is sort of like saying your kid is 15 years old, you're averaging 5 years old and 15 years old. So even though he's 6 feet tall, we think of him as 4.5 feet tall. It's insane. It does fluctuate. It has been a very, very hot last 12 months. The climate scientists do not know why. They literally cannot, their models are not working. We could have a long conversation about this. All I'm saying is it's a race between what we can do and are doing, which I think is better than people know, that I think is our ability to do it is better than anybody is really willing to accept because it seems better than it should be. But the challenge is bigger than people thought it was in January of 2023, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting to note that it's not getting covered in the way that it needs to. And as you said, that it reminds me of the power of fiction and narratives to make things more real. And had the opportunity just recently to hear Kim Stanley Robinson, for example, talk about Ministry of the Future with this horrible opening vignette about a heat wave, a deadly heat wave. Yeah. And he said, look, it's a problem if me, the fiction writer, is getting called in to be an expert on climate. That is a problem. That is not a good thing. But I think to your point of raising urgency in more ways and doing more things. And I'll say this kind of kidding, not kidding, but I am wondering in the spirit, if you can't be a climate czar, as I was reading the book, I was like, why isn't there a climate Shark Tank? And I'm kidding, not kidding. Like, if we think about the need for more stories to get out there about the range of innovations, like what can we do to make them more interesting, to make them more available? So that's maybe if Climate Czar is not available, Mark Cuban, I'm sure would love to work with you. Let's hear a few more questions. Yes.
So first, I would like to say, sorry. I would like to just say thank you, Tom, for what you are doing.
You know, I paid Craig to say that.
All of us. No. No, seriously, you have chosen to commit a lot of time and a lot of resources to this, and it's a very important issue, and I'm immensely grateful. Do have a question. What do you think of mini nuclear? And is that a huge potential, and can it be funded with private investment?
So let's talk for a second about not just small nuclear reactors, which is part of, which is Craig's question, but is only part of the nuclear question. So if we think about nuclear for a sec, there are two big ways of basically deriving electricity from nuclear. One is fission, which is the kind of nuclear power that we've had since the Second World War. And the US has a bunch, and we've built one new nuclear plant in Georgia, and it went way over cost. But they're big plants, and now there's a move to see if we can do smaller plants that are fission. And then the other kind of nuclear is fusion, which we've never successfully done commercially and is a hugely difficult scientific and engineering problem. So let me just deal with each of these. So let me say this. The issue with nuclear energy, and I'm not religious about nuclear energy. I'm just data driven. Is it inexpensive? Is it safe? Because it doesn't have any carbon pollution associated with it. And so the fission reactors that we have in the United States, when people have tried to recreate that, they've gone way over cost. So that they've been literally, the Georgia one, I think, was something like 4x what they thought it would cost, which means the electricity is 4x what they thought it would cost. And so people have been trying to build much smaller nuclear reactors that don't have the same kind of toxic nuclear waste. So the nuclear waste that comes from the existing nuclear plants, we have no idea what to do with. I mean, basically, they wanted to put it in Yucca Mountain. I don't know if you guys remember this. And the people in Nevada said, it's toxic, it kills us, and it lasts 100,000 years. No. So basically what the US does with toxic nuclear waste is they just leave it where it is. And they sort of think we'll deal with that later, 100,000 years later. The good thing about the small nuclear reactors is that we believe the toxicity of the nuclear waste is much less and much less dangerous. And so the question will be, what does it really cost? And for the first time, they've broken ground on these new, in Wyoming, one of the small nuclear reactors for a company that's been around at least 12 years, because I remember them talking to me. So we'll find out. It's a question of what is it really going to cost? What is the energy really going to cost in the real world? It does solve one problem. Is it cheap and safe? We're going to find out. So that's one thing. Second thing is fusion. So fusion is basically recreating the sun. And just so you know that I really am data driven, I invested in it in 2006. And if it works, it's basically limitless energy. You've recreated the sun. It's hard. So there are probably 72 companies trying to solve nuclear fusion. 12 of them people take pretty seriously. 5 or 6 of them people take really seriously. And I was talking to the CEO of one of those companies probably 2.5 months ago. They've been working on it since I invested in it in 2006. The most recent reactor that they built, or the one they're building now, has to get to 70 million degrees. They sent me a note. I invested in 2006, and like 10 years after I invested, they sent me a note as an investor. Incredible home run. We have created nuclear fusion for 1/1,000,000th of a second. It's really hard to do. 70 million degrees does not work commercially. He said, in order for this to work commercially, we need 100 million degrees. I mean, think about 100. It's not like burning your hand on the toaster. 100 million degrees. So they also have to develop materials that can handle 100 million degrees. Not trivial. It's a very hard scientific and technical thing, but it's something that if they can get it, and they're really brilliant people working on this, that it solves a lot of problems. And the question for me in all this stuff is timing. Because we have a problem that is time bound. Winning slowly is losing. Because in the meantime, we keep cumulatively adding to the parts per million of CO2 and CO2 equivalent, and the world keeps heating up. And so when I think about nuclear, my question is it cheap? Is it safe? And when do we get it? And when do we get it in size? And so, to me, for a whole bunch of reasons, including the fact that people are just scared of the word nuclear. People are nervous. They remember Chernobyl. They remember Japan. They think about 3 Mile Island. And so they do belt and suspenders to make sure we don't have a disaster. And that adds to cost. Because it's slower, more tests, more lawyers. And so, Craig, when I think about it, it's just data to me. If it works and it's cheap and it's safe, I'm totally for it. And we're going to find out. And there are people working on it. And, that's what we call, I think, business. Take your best shot. If you fail, you fail.
Yeah.
But we're going to find out how it's going to go.
Yeah. Thank you for that. All right, we're going to take George, our friend here, who actually came in from a faraway place, Tom, to come in and see you here. So, George, I'm going to ask
The
this.
Bahamas.
Yes.
What is your plan to combat rising sea levels, coastal erosion, and beach erosion? And what do you use in your soil when you do regenerative farming, basically?
Okay. So let me say that Regen Ag, I'm going to throw that to Kat at all times, but let me talk for a second about rising sea levels in the Bahamas. And I think you guys got the point that George Saunders is from the Bahamas. And it's partially about rising sea level. It's also about storms. And I also said to you guys probably 30 minutes ago, the less you've done to cause the problem, the more you're going to suffer. And so for the people who live in low-lying island nations around the world, they're asking, what is going on? And why are we suffering for something we had virtually nothing to do with? And so when I'll give you one thing about Pakistan and then one thing about Antarctica, and then I'll talk about the Bahamas. I mean, in Pakistan, 35 million people were made homeless by a climate-related flood. 35 million people. And I think the country had cumulatively emitted 0.1% of the CO2. So, this is not adjudicated fairly by nature. This is just the way it's going. Secondly, in terms of rising sea levels, the scientists don't know how fast the sea is rising. And I think I've been saying for the last 10 years, just put on a loop the following statement. Antarctica is melting faster than we ever expected. We did not understand how this was working. And that is true. They've said at least, oh God, it's got to be 10 times they've upped the speed with which. So Antarctica can raise the sea level, oh my God, 60 feet. And that's expected to be a very long time. That's not this century. But what we're watching is something faster than the scientists have been saying. And so if you live in a low-lying island nation that is subject to hurricanes because the water is warmer, you're at risk. And that's a risk that really no one has an answer for. So that, for instance, I'll give you one more point. There's a company that does environmentally sensitive. It sites and it has new materials to basically build seawalls. And I don't know if you know, but people have sued the county of Marin for not putting up enough seawalls because they say it's going to happen and you guys have got to get ahead of it and you haven't done it. So we're going to sue you. 180 cities in the world are at risk, including all the cities that you think, the big cities that you think of, London, Shanghai, Boston, New York, to rising sea levels. And some of them can build seawalls and some of them it doesn't help. San Francisco talked to me about a seawall that would cover a quarter of the city 5 years, probably 6 years ago, and it's going to cost $5 billion. A quarter of the city. It would just protect the downtown. So the cost of adapting to climate change, to rising sea levels, and to storms is amazingly high. And so when we think about people living in the Bahamas, some of the islands in the Bahamas are really close to sea level. It's hard to understand how to adapt to it. And I know that George has some points to make, and he's going to grab me afterwards and force me to think hard about it, and I understand that. But I'm just saying, there is no, just so you know, Back Bay in Boston, okay, or the marina in San Francisco, they're on landfill. That means they're that much above sea level. So it's not like we're not at risk. everyone is at risk. And the idea of adapting to this in terms of what it's going to take, it's, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Stopping this problem is way better for us than trying to adapt to a changing climate that is going to cause a lot of things that we've never thought of, but some we've definitely thought of. And you can just see those storms coming in the Caribbean. You can just see it happening. And it's like, okay, we have to turn that around, or else the adaptation is going to force people to move. That's honestly where we're on the course we're on. We're talking about what they call planned retreat. That means moving away from the places where you can no longer live. And that is a really difficult thing for the world to handle.
Yeah, thank you, George, and thank you for coming. Appreciate it and appreciate the question. So, as you gather, we're gonna close on a couple of themes that we picked up on, and maybe Tom, just what you said. The point is stark. We are all climate people. We are all climate people. None of us is immune from what is coming, and we have an opportunity, if not an obligation, to join the war against climate. And what Tom just shared, that answer, and throughout the whole book, this is a hopeful book, but it is not a Pollyanna book. This is a roadmap for how to become more active in our climate stance, for how to all, whether we are walk-ons or recruits, get into this fight.
Can I make one point, Lisa?
Yeah.
So, I do compare to World War II because I think people chose to make a stand there. But I also will say that it was an incredibly meaningful and positive experience for an awful lot of people. That it was a hugely positive experience for this country. And I can remember, for the people in my parents' generation who were involved, it was the thing they were proudest of. And the fact that they did something difficult, in that case, also very dangerous for many of them, but that they all pitched in for, was something that absolutely defined what they thought they contributed during the time they were on the planet. And that's, across the board, not just men who were in then the armed services, but people who are contributing at home and in the various ways that people can contribute and the way that they live their lives. Yeah. And so I do not look at this as an eat your gruel experience. I see this as, you want to play in a tough game, that's okay. It's really valuable, it's really important, and it's really rewarding. And that's where I think we're going. And that's, I think, the spirit we have to take it in, is that, yeah, we're going to win, and winning is really fun, but it's really important to win too. So winning in something important is actually incredibly meaningful in terms of defining what you're doing on the planet.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to close with just a couple sentences that just echoes that sentiment. As you close the book, you say, it can be hard in the midst of a crisis to think we might not survive the moment, that we might not just survive the moment, but emerge from it on the cusp of something remarkable. But that's exactly what we've done before. If we come together in this moment, then one day our grandchildren will be able to say the same thing about us. So again, please join me in echoing Craig's gratitude, and I think all of our gratitude, Tom, for what you've done, your leadership, for writing this book, giving us a roadmap for how we can all partake.
But let me say, there are a lot of people in this audience who've done a lot. I feel embarrassed to be signaled out on this. I just feel as if I look at the people from my family who are here, and the people who are my friends who are here and what they've done, and the people who I've met tonight. I know that people are very committed on this. I'm very respectful and grateful for what people do. I'm very far from alone in that.
Thank you.